Mahalo Lele, and welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. Today, I will be a lone ranger for our live digital kava session today. Mr. Aotearoa was here in the United States a week or so ago, and so we spent the majority of the time there. We did release a new episode on the podcast just from a previous live digital kava session. We're going to listen to a podcast here, short episode, 20 minutes. And it's really on the oral history on the Malietoa, quote unquote, war. And I say quote unquote, if you guys can't tell already, I'm not a believer that this was a full blown war and that somehow there was a new nation born out of this. I'm much more of a believer that it was a scuffle. In the sense it was a battle, not necessarily a war, and that Talakai Faiki really wasn't expelled, but I understand that my position there is a minority. I thought this was a good transition, as some of the comments here this is another important way to understand oral history, and how oral history, you need to kind of just listen to it. It has a lot of good things in it, but you can't just take it all in. And oral history, one of the weaknesses of oral history is it takes a life of its own. And so you have to be very careful with that. And also, not all oral histories are created equal, just like not all scientific studies are created equal. This is not something that is just uniquely to oral history, but oral history does suffer from some of these challenges. But this is kind of an interesting concept. From what I can understand, this Enati creative, it looks like it's all driven. The voices here and the people are probably AI. It sounds like it's AI, but it's based off of data from, looking like using AI to search data online, something similar to what we did with the languages, but more in developing a podcast and a storyline. But we're going to listen through it, want to have some comments and discuss through it and react to the content itself. Once again, Enati Creative, this is a storyline that, we appreciate people who make content online. The more people that make content, the more it gives us opportunity to hear, learn, and then react more, right? This is the digital kava sessions here, where ideas are brought in, we discuss it, we listen to it, you have an open mind. You don't have to believe everything, you don't have to accept everything, but the point is we're sitting here having a conversation, having ideas, and then we go from there and see where it goes. Let me unmute it. Let me know if you guys don't hear the sound. Sometimes I mute some of the background screens and forget to do so, but let's jump into it.
Hello to the deep dive. Ever wondered about those ancient ties that bind Pacific Island nations? Today, we're diving deep into a story that's just packed with powerful chiefs, epic sea voyages, and, well, a really dramatic showdown for freedom.
Yeah, it's quite the saga.
Get ready to explore the fascinating and, intertwined histories of Tonga and Samoa. It's a place where friendship and rivalry really played out on this grand Pacific stage.
Exactly.
We'll try to uncover the story of a mighty empire's reach and the legendary rebellion that ultimately reshaped the Samoan world.
And what's so fascinating here, I think, is just the sheer interconnectedness. These weren't isolated cultures, not at all.
Right.
It was this dynamic relationship spanning centuries. And these interactions between Tonga and Samoa, they offer such a powerful lens, a way to understand the complexities of power, influence, resistance, all that in the region.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've really immersed ourselves in historical analyses, but also alongside those incredibly rich oral traditions passed down, through generations in both Tonga and Samoa.
Which are so vital here.
Totally. So our mission today is to really try and understand this pivotal time, the era when the Tui Tonga Empire exerted its power in Samoa, the incredible story of the Samoan rebellion that rose up against it, and of course the legendary origins of a title that holds just immense prestige in Samoa, even today, Malietoa.
The huge one.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational period.
Right. Let's maybe start with the architects. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Tui Tonga Dynasty.
Oh,
What
snap,
if,
people.
when uncertainty is high, heck,
This is what happens when the podcast is on a budget. We don't have the funds yet to pay for the free ads, guys.
TCE with the founder Ahoeitu.
Ahoeitu.
Let's come back
significant
here
of
and missed a
architects,
little bit.
Yeah.
The Tui Tonga Dynasty. Their origins, they trace back to around 950 CE with the founder Ahoeitu.
Ahoeitu.
And what's really significant about him is his lineage. Tradition tells us he was the son of the sky god Tangaloa in Samoa.
Oh, right. The same deity.
Yeah, an immortal Tongan woman. And the key takeaway here isn't just like a nice story. This divine connection.
I want to pause it there. Obviously, our position here on the podcast, anyone who's new, Tangaloa wasn't a god, right? There's conflicting oral histories across the board. Tangaloa wasn't a god. He was a man. That was the original, founding father line, right? The founding fathers of the Polynesian Empire, that being Maui, Tangaloa, and the Taula, right? Maui, the navigational scientific leader. Tangaloa is the kingly line that also has a priesthood with it. And then the Taula, which is the priestly line, right? So those are the three. And they say 950 AD. We believe that the Tui Tonga goes much further than that. And then once again, they say a Tongan woman. They say that because the Niuas are part of Tonga. But in all perspective, there was no Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, whatever. It was all, either part of the Polynesian Tui Tonga Empire or not. And Popua lived on the in the Niuas, and she came to Tongatapu because that's where Tangaloa resided. Okay, so just some context on where we stand there.
Bestowed this sacred authority on the Tui Tonga. It really elevated them, beyond just earthly rulers.
So right from the start, they weren't just powerful chiefs. They had this perceived direct link to the divine. That's a potent source of authority, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely potent.
Yeah.
And it seems they really leveraged this status to build this, far-reaching influence.
Okay.
The empire saw significant growth. It reached its zenith under the 10th Tui Tonga, Momo, and especially the 11th Tui de Tui. That's around the 11th, 12th century CE.
Right.
And their influence, it spread across this vast maritime area, a true thalassocracy, a sea-based empire.
Yeah.
We're talking modern-day Tonga, Samoa, though many often stayed independent.
Yeah. Okay. Important distinction.
Yeah. New Fiji, lots of other islands scattered across the Pacific. It's huge. And this vast reach, it just underscores their maritime prowess, their ability to project power.
Across those distances.
Exactly. Facilitated by those remarkable double-hulled canoes, the Kalia.
Just want to pause there. That's the one thing that I can't remember one of the viewers that mentioned earlier that the Tui Tonga Empire was not always driven by military power, even though the Navy, obviously, of the Tongan Navy was the huge advantage. It was that religious component to the Tui Tonga that really provided stability. And that's a very important part to understanding the Polynesian Empire's stability and evolution over time, right? This is something that's really important to understand. When the first set of Westerners came to Tonga, or the Polynesian Empire, but especially to Tonga, where they started to interact with and see different leaders like the Tui Tonga, the Tui Kanokupolu, and the Tui Hatakalaua, the English, first contact with the English, they couldn't understand the political and the religious structure as to who had power, right? Captain Cook recognized that certain people would say, yeah, I'm the king, I'm the Tui Hapai, I'm the Tui Vava'u, I'm the blah, blah, blah. But then they also noticed that whenever the Tui Tonga showed up, the guys who said they were the kings and in charge were never around. So he understood there was an understanding that there was a complex nature of the political and the religious structure of the leadership in Tonga, right? And This is an important concept to understand on how the Tu'i Tonga, the Tu'i Hatakalawa, and the Tu'i Kanokupolu came into existence. Because military power was not the primary factor of the Tu'i Tonga's rule, he, meaning the Tu'i Tonga, could separate himself from the military, the administrative portions of the government, and still have influence and rule over the entire empire. Westerners don't have that full understanding, though, even though you could kind of make it a little bit that they saw, even through some of the popes and other, parts of Christianity where there was a merger between religion and government. Though we've kind of went away from that here in the Western civilizations. But this is the way to understand how the Tu'i Tonga and the Tu'i Hatakalawa and the Tu'i Kanokupolu relationships existed. The Tu'i Tonga in the beginning had religious, political, and military power, right? Then the Tu'i Tonga hands off the administrative, the political, and the administrative and military role to the Tu'i Hatakalawa, but maintain the religious sacredness to it, right? That's how the Tu'i Tonga was able to still be elevated above the Tu'i Hatakalawa. The Western perspectives are, the Tu'i Hatakalawa overtook the Tu'i Tonga and took control. Why would they say that? Because the Western civilization I won't say only, but heavily values military and political power over religious power. And that's how they understand governance, through military and political power. That wasn't always the case with our Polynesian ancestors, right? Then you go handful of generations with the Tu'i Hatakalawa. The Tu'i Hatakalawa says, I want to have a little bit more of that religious prestige, and I can't have that if I'm stuck doing the quote unquote administrative and political power. So that's where the Tu'i Kanokupolu comes into place. It was a passing on of the torch of responsibility of doing the work. And it wasn't, the Tu'i Hatakalawa usurped the Tu'i Tonga, or that the Tu'i Kanokupolu usurped the Tu'i Hatakalawa. It was a very unique and different perspective on how power was structured, right? Here, before we continue, looks like there's a few questions here. T Styles says, if you believe that Tangaloa being a man and not a god, but you believe in Hikuleo as a god of Israel. Yeah, I mean, people make fun of that, right? People make fun of that, but here's the main reasons for it, T Style. Tangaloa, from our perspective, we have a specific location where he resided. A lot of oral history behind that. And the Tu'i Tonga settlements, they had specific areas in each of their settlements that were named after where Tangaloa lived. Peretoa, right, was the location where Ahoeitu climbs up. It was actually a grove near Tapuhia or Langi. And so there is a lot of oral history and even pointing to a physical location where Tangaloa resided as a man. And that Tangaloa was basically that was the ruler of the Polynesian Empire, was Tangaloa. Then, for whatever reason, something happened, right? And I can only look at history to potentially explain what could have happened, but something happened where Tangaloa said, the eldest is not going to continue. The eldest would still inherit what their father had, meaning they would be recognized as absorbing as the eldest, but the heir and the power to rule would go to the Tu'i Tonga. And something happened there. That's the whole story behind Ahoeitu being eaten and died, having to be resurrected. Something happened there. Now, for Hikuleo, believe that Hikuleo is the god of Israel. The reason why, there's multiple reasons why I say that. People can make fun of it, whatever. George Vason when he was, kind of gave up Christianity, living amongst the Tongans, he says that there were many, many practices of the ancient Tongans that he said have a odd familiarity, with some of the practices of ancient Israel. The knowledge of an afterlife, not just for the chiefs and so forth, but for all, that was something that was widely, expected. And then looking at the name Hikuleo, the tail end of the voice, Jehovah many times would reside in a cloud and speak. And that's who led Israel in the 40 years. So there's other things behind it, but yes, that's my position on that. That's why I believe Polynesians embrace Christianity so heavily, is because it does ring so similar to what our ancestors believed. And so that's some of the thoughts behind that. UTOL says, was there a Tu'i Samoa or Tu'i Ha'amoa? Yes, more than likely, just like there was a Tu'i Futuna or Uvea. There was a Tu'i there. It rotated with families. The Tu'i Manua seems to be the best candidate for that UTOL of a title there, and it was rotated amongst, heirs from the 3 different islands in Manua. So I think that there was some kind of, if it wasn't that exact name UTOL, but it had either Tu'i Manua or someone of influence that would have had a similar title. Let's see. If we are talking about that, then Tahitians must have been the rulers, as Tapu Tapu Atea had the most religious power in Polynesia. Well, that's the interesting thing. That's why we got to have these conversations, Josh. I mean, someone's right and someone's wrong, or, we got to understand that. We have a whole episode talking about Tapu Tapu Atea, and from our perspective, how do we make sense of that? In the podcast that we're watching, it mentions Momo and Tu'itatui, right? It is around that time that Momo was the one who instituted where not everyone from every corner of the empire had to come to Tongatapu to bring twice a year, because twice a year, everyone in the empire had to come to Tongatapu, the Inasi, which is the more of the religious tithe to the Tu'itonga because of his religious position. And the Inasi, the second tribute, the Inasi was more for the political / administrative role of the government. That was more like a tax. Once again, the Polo Polo is more like a tithe, a religious offering. The Inasi is much more of a administrative tax that everyone would bring to Tonga, to Tongatapu specifically. And so it is my perspective. How would I explain Tapu Tapu Atea? That could have been a designated location where Momo said, instead of everyone in Eastern Polynesia coming twice a year to Tongatapu, you will meet at Tapu Tapu Atea. I will have a designated representative of mine to receive your Polo Polo or your Inasi on behalf of the Tu'itonga. Then I don't know if that individual would then make, that one single family or individual would then make the trip to Tongatapu on behalf of all the islands. But that we have an episode that kind of walks through that. That's something to consider. I mean, I don't know. That's the way I would approach that. Let's see. We kind of talk about this. Why does Tapu Tapu Atea have similar structures, the stone structures like the Tu'itonga has in La Paja? Once again, Nonsky, that's why we said it could have been a designated location to receive the Inasi and the Polo Polo on behalf of the Tu'itonga. Another comment here from Josh. He says, we cannot act like Tangaloa could only be used as a name for just... No, we do not believe that Tangaloa was one name, right? It's just like Maui. Maui was a title, not a individual person. That's why the name Maui sounds like it lives for forever, is that when person inherits that title, they take on the name, just like Tangaloa. Tangaloa was a title that name was inherited by the person who picks up the title. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Maria Water Bears. Tu'i Tijuana on my dad's side. 100% best tacos in the land. Vaini Potogiai. So, all right. Looks like we caught up on the majority of those questions there. Let's head back to the podcast.
So Hikuleo, right?
And they're, highly developed navigational skills, really sophisticated stuff.
Wow. Imagine the skill, the daring it took navigating like that in those vessels. It really highlights the ambition, the ingenuity of these early Polynesian navigators.
It really does.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. How did they actually manage to hold it all together, this widespread domain?
Yeah, good question. It seems like several interconnected elements were pretty crucial. First, there was the Inasi, a sophisticated tribute system. Basically, subject islands had to send annual gifts, often their best resources, crafted goods, to the Tu'i Tonga back on Tagatapu.
Okay.
And the key insight here, I think, is that this wasn't just about stuff, about material goods. It was a powerful mechanism for constantly reinforcing Tonga's dominance and the Tu'i Tonga's sacred status, in the eyes of everyone else.
Right. A constant reminder of who's in charge.
Exactly.
Okay.
And secondly, you had these flourishing trade networks crisscrossing the...
I want to pause that real quick because I think here's an interesting thing that would be, I think, a good piece of knowledge that we got from Maui Tekelangi. So the Polo, they mentioned here the Inasi, the Polo was always managed by the Tu'i Tonga. Even when the Tu'i Tonga resided in Ha'amoa, in Samoa for multiple generations, the Tu'i Tonga would always come to Tongatapu for the Polo. The Inasi, as we mentioned, is much more of a administrative or tax kind of situation, that when the Tu'i Tonga handed off the administrative and the political power to the Tu'i Hatagalaua and eventually the Tu'i Kanokupolu, those two lines managed the Inasi. Okay, because it was much more a political or a tax situation. Now, it is not correct, or at least from Maui Tekelangi's perspective, to assume that when this tax was brought to Tongatapu, that it all stayed in Tongatapu, right? The way it functioned is this. All the different islands would bring those products. Those products would be brought to the Tu'i Hatagalaua or the Tu'i Kanokupolu. Some of that product would be absorbed by the Tu'i Hatagalaua or the Tu'i Kanokupolu. However, other products were then organized and exchanged. The Tu'i Kanokupolu and the Tu'i Hatagalaua were responsible for, Ha'amoa, we all know Samoa had the best axes, stone axes and so forth. They would bring that. They would bring mats. Uvea and Futuna would have something that they were really good at. They brought that to the table, right? Whatever was brought from, let's say, Tapu Tapu Atea from East Polynesia was brought to the table. Stuff from Fiji all over. Some of that was absorbed by the Tu'i Hatagalaua, Tu'i Kanokupolu. Then they also had the responsibility of, take some of the stones and divide the stone axes and divide it amongst everybody that was there. Whatever Uvea brought was divided, and there was a distribution of all these goods amongst all the different families. And when I say families, the Polynesian Empire was a giant network of family, right? Because the practice of the Tu'i Tonga and also of Tangaloa was intermarrying throughout all the islands to establish the leading families and governing families on all the islands that had blood ties back to Tongatapu. That's what held it together. That's what allowed the stability in the Polynesian Empire for thousands of years. And that is how that relationship was managed. Now, want to come back to the thought of the Inasi was, yes, political tribute, a tax, but it also was a redistribution of all these highly cherished products throughout the empire that was brought and distributed amongst all the families in the empire. That was the massive network of trade that happened once a year. And that's where a lot of the majority of that trade happened from our perspective. It's not that they were little stores throughout all of these different islands. It was more of everybody came to Tongatapu for the Inasi, delivered their best products from where they came. In return, because it's a very long, painful, and dangerous journey to make it to travel to Tonga for the Inasi, and to help maintain the prestige and the relationship, you give something back in return so that those families would take back to their respective islands of evidence of look at what other parts of the empire produce that is of great value. And that would be a cherished item within the families throughout Polynesia. All right, let's come back.
Empire, exchanging prize things like Samoan basalt azes.
Oh yeah, those are famous.
Fine mats, distinctive pottery. And beyond just the economics, this exchange created this sort of web of interdependence. And it acted as a conduit, spreading ideas, innovations across the region.
Like cultural diffusion too.
Precisely. And thirdly, strategic elite intermarriage. That played a vital role.
Yeah.
Particularly this practice called tokatufa.
Tokatufa.
Yeah. High-ranking women from influential families on other islands were brought to Tonga to marry into the royal lineage.
Okay.
And then their kids could potentially go back and rule their home islands. So it solidified alliances, extended Tongan influence through these kinship ties.
Wow.
So you see how these things work together, right?
Yeah.
The Enati provided resources, reinforced.
This is something that's really important about the work that's happening right now in the conversations. The only person, I even had to go to Grok to search online, who else out online is speaking about Tokatufa. There's only one source that Grok came back with, and that is Te Vita Fale. Te Vita Fale is the only one that has published articles discussing this ancient practice. That's why I'm pretty sure, this is all driven by AI on this podcast. This is why it's important that we're having this content being put out, right? To me, it's already having impact. This concept of Tokatufa is a concept that only Te Vita Fale and the Polynesianized podcast has published online, and it's already having impact. This is why we're having these conversations. This is why creating content and putting it out there and really establishing those ideas is really important. If you have a desire to put content out there, 100% encourage it. Put these ideas out there, let people have access to it, and then let people decide what they want to believe. But to me, when I would listen to this for the first time, I was like, this is evidence of why it's important to put out the content that we need to do, because it leads to more people understanding it. And now that we have access to AI, and as AI continues to grow, the more important it is to put that content out there. So it was kind of cool to see this this channel bring out that concept of Tokatufa, because that's something that really, from everything we can see, originates from the Polynesianized podcast and Te Vita Fale's work.
Authority,
Yeah.
Trade fostered interdependence, strategic marriages built alliances. It was this like multifaceted approach to keeping the empire going.
That's a really sophisticated system, using economic, political, even family ties to maintain control. But as you mentioned, and our sources remind us, the Tui Tonga weren't the first major power in this part of the Pacific, were they?
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. Before the Tui Tonga really rose to prominence, there was a significant Samoan-based maritime power centered in the Menua Island group.
Manu again?
Yeah, led by the Tui Manoa. Some oral traditions even suggest a time when the Tui Manoa held sway over Tonga itself.
Really? Over Tonga?
Yeah, and the Tonga had to kind of actively assert its independence before starting its own expansion. So it's fascinating to think the Tui Tonga...
That just, hey, that's one idea out there, right? We've tackled this over and over. We've done chokeholds. We've, put triangles, guillotines. We even had some knockouts with Ufi pits and, archaeological evidence that the Tui Manua is only 500 years old. But hey, it is what it is. It is what it is.
Tonga's arrival in Samoa was more like a shift in a long-standing regional power dynamic. not the start of it all.
Right. They weren't stepping into a vacuum.
Exactly. They weren't stepping into a void.
That provides really crucial context for what happens next. Okay, so
We're Phoenix Energy, a family-owned oil company focused on
Really understand. I don't, like I said, we don't agree with the Tu'imanua as a empire. We believe the Tu'imanua existed, but not necessarily as an empire that governed.
Tongan influence in Samoa, particularly Upolu and Savai'i, it becomes quite established. How long are we talking here, roughly?
Well, the oral traditions generally point to a period of maybe 3 to 4 centuries.
Wow, that long.
Yeah, 300 or 400 years of direct Tongan rule or, significant hegemony in those parts of Samoa. That's a substantial chunk of time. It would have definitely impacted the social, political, cultural landscape.
For sure.
And this likely involved, Tongan governors overseeing things, the regular collection of tribute going back to Tonga.
The Enati again.
And
Yeah.
implementing Tongan administrative systems. The settlement of Safotu on Savai'i. That's often mentioned in oral accounts as maybe being a Tongan center during this time.
Safotu. Okay. And the figure who really stands out in the Samoan accounts of this period, the one associated with the eventual pushback, that's Tui Tonga Talakaifeki.
Yes, Talakaifeki. He's a truly pivotal figure in this whole narrative, especially from the Samoan perspective.
Right.
Historical analysis suggests he might have been the 15th Tui Tonga, or maybe a ruler around then, whose name appears in Tongan king lists as Ulumipupu.
Okay.
Now, Tongan historical accounts, they do acknowledge a period of unrest, a Samoan revolt during his reign.
Mhm.
But the Samoan oral traditions, they paint a much more critical, much more vivid picture.
How so?
Well, in these narratives, Talakaifeki is depicted as...
Well, and that's what I think is kind of interesting, right? The Tongan oral history recognizes that an event happened during Talakaifeki's time, right? But also in Ha'amoa, it's a much more intricate thing and much more pivotal. And granted, it was a big event in Ha'amoa's history, but I think that's kind of indicative too. So we'll see how it goes.
Frankly, a cruel and tyrannical ruler. The stories detail accusations of enslaving Samoans, forcing them into really hard labor, like building forts and roads.
Wow.
And just generally ruling with excessive harshness, brutality.
That's a very strong indictment. It sounds like the Samoan oral tradition really hammers home the oppressive nature of his rule. What's the significance of that emphasis, do you think?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture, right? Samoan identity, the legitimacy of their later autonomy, this powerful emphasis on Talakaifeki's alleged tyranny, it serves a crucial purpose.
Which is?
It legitimizes the Samoan uprising that follows. By painting the Tongan ruler as this unbearable oppressor, the narrative tones the rebellion from just a power struggle into a necessary, morally justified act of liberation.
Okay, I see.
It gives a clear reason for the Samoan actions. It boosts the heroic status of the resistance leaders, and ultimately, it reinforces the legitimacy of the Malietoa title that comes out of this very conflict.
Right.
So the way Talakaifeki is remembered directly supports that whole foundational story of Samoan independence.
That makes perfect sense. You kind of need that narrative of oppression to justify such a massive act of defiance and setting up a whole new order.
So who are the key players then? Who spearheaded this Samoan rebellion?
The main figures in the Samoan resistance were these brothers, Tuna and Fata, often described as sons or descendants of a respected chief named Atioki.
Tuna and Fata.
Okay. We also hear about their elder brother, Savea, and a particularly, remarkable nephew, Ulumasui.
Ulumasui, got it.
And notably, Tuna and Fata, they already had this.
I never heard really much about Ulumasui until this podcast, and so or this, listening to this episode, kind of looked into it. They talk about him a lot more. Usually, I just hear about Tuna and Fata, and then Savea, who actually becomes a Malietoa. So yeah, I mean, this AI podcast was still pretty instructive.
This reputation for bravery, for strength, which ironically seems to be what made Talakaifeki suspicious, maybe even fearful of their growing influence. So the very things that probably earned them respect among Samoans made them a threat to the Tongan ruler. What finally kicked things off? What was the catalyst?
Well, sensing Talakaifaike's unease, maybe potential plans against them, Tuna and Fata are said to have basically fled.
Yeah.
They sought refuge in Alipata on the eastern side of Upolu.
Alipata, okay.
And from there, this strategic spot, they sent out messengers across Samoa, rallying different chiefdoms, communities, trying to unite them for a common cause, kick out the Tongans.
See, this is where, kind of like the AI individuals here. See a couple people because, hey, this sounds like AI. It's 100% AI. But what I find interesting is there's a lot of politics that goes into oral history, right? Of course, the Malietoas are going to make it sound like Talakaifaike was oppressive, and he may have been. Xiaoxi Ilayu says there's oral history that he's found, and just some evidence he's found that this was not necessarily oppression as seen, but more of Talakaifaike wanted to switch the focus from Tangaloa to Hikuleo, and that there was opposition in Ha'amoa to that. And so that's what makes it interesting. But I want to bring up here is they make it sound like Tuna and Fata were like going around and they united the entire island. Well, once again, I think that's embellishment. And I'll give my reasons for it later, but I think that's more of entertainment value and boosting for politics than maybe actual history.
Reclaim their autonomy.
Right.
And the rebellion, according to the main accounts, it hits its climax with this meticulously planned surprise attack.
An ambush.
Exactly. An ambush planned during a big feast.
And I want to reiterate this. There is no strong history or even oral history of a war, right? Like they mentioned here, it's like, oh, the climax of the rebellion. You got to remember, the climax is just so far, there's not like a bunch of battles, like we look at Taufa Ahau, we hear a bunch of those battles and it's recorded, and you don't just overthrow or unite an entire archipelago of islands just from one battle, right? There's actually takes years, and it takes a lot of alliances, relationship buildings, even marriages to unite a handful of islands. So this idea that Tuna and Fata just overnight united everyone, and then, there's just this one singular battle that wins the war. Dude, that never happens. That never happens. So you already, for me personally, excuse me, it already gets suspicious when they're like, oh, yeah, it was this great battle of liberation. But all we hear is one battle. We don't have extensive discussions. I mean, even from before actual contact and recorded history with the missionaries, even in Tonga, there are legendary battles that happen that are documented in different places. And it's always multiple battles, not just one. That just one battle that won a war. That's unheard of in my opinion. But once again, for the Malietoa side, of course they would want to make it sound like they won a war, because it elevates their title and their position and their prestige. Of course you would want to have that story told.
In Alipata. Some traditions even say it was for Talakaifaike's birthday.
No way.
Yeah. And crucially, weapons clubs, other traditional weapons, were hidden beforehand. Some accounts have this great image of them buried under the sand where the feast was happening.
Wow.
And the signal, the agreed upon signal for the attack, it was the start of the Tongan Maritime dance.
Using their own cultural performance against them, that's incredibly dramatic. Okay, so what happened when the signal was given?
We had
one thing I find interesting here, and I think important to note, is it is out of this event. It is out of this event that certain practices that happen to this day in Tonga is practiced to this day. So really, some of the stories are they hid a lot of their weapons under the pigs, because the pigs used to face down when you would present them to the Tuitonga, right? And they hid them under there or inside the pigs. This is why, and I didn't know this until, even when I was in Tonga, I always wondered why, why do they go? They slap the pig, they lift it up, they count it, and they're visually inspected one by one. It is because of this, right? this is the reason why, because of this event, the Tu'i Tonga changes, or the Farefa, they change the whole ritual of presentation of tribute. Because of that, they're counted, the pigs are inspected, they're lifted up, make sure there's nothing under. So that's how we know that this battle with Tuna and Fata actually happened, right? So, and that's the impact to this day that this story has on even how Tonga behaves in their traditional functions because of this.
Well, upon that signal, hundreds of Samoan warriors led by Tuna and Fata, they just rose up, launched this swift, coordinated attack on the unsuspecting Tongans.
Chaos, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Some versions even add this detail of the Samoan dancers who were unarmed, kicking away the sand to reveal the hidden weapons.
Nice touch.
The attack was fierce, very effective. Significant Tongan casualties. Some accounts estimate maybe 200 Tongan warriors fell just in that initial assault. Yeah. Talkai Faiki himself, along with the remaining Tongans, they fled westward towards the coast at Mulafano, trying to get to their canoes, their fleet.
Trying to escape.
But the Samoan leaders were relentless. They pursued them. Fata and Ulumasui led one group chasing along the south coast of Upolu, while Tuna and another chief, Taula, they chased along the northern route.
So a coordinated pursuit, too. And it's during this chase that Ulumasui, the nephew, really comes into his own right. We hear these almost supernatural stories about him.
Indeed. Ulumasui is this really captivating figure, often associated with extraordinary abilities, a manifestation of what Polynesian cultures call mana.
Mana. Spiritual power.
Exactly. Spiritual power, divine favor. One really well-known story is about an incident where Talakai Faiki, maybe as a last act of intimidation, he tasks Tuna with moving this enormous boulder. Impossible feat, right? Threatens him with death if he fails.
Yikes.
So Tuna can't move it. He turns to Ulumasui for help. And Ulumasui, after some, incantation, spiritual preparation, he supposedly summons legions of sea creatures, eels, octopuses, other marine life, who miraculously work together to push this massive boulder into the sea.
That's incredible.
And there are even accounts where Tuna and Fata, after the victory, they start quarreling, tragically kill each other.
Oh, no.
Only to be miraculously brought back to life by Ulamasui's powerful mana.
Wow. So these aren't just cool stories. They obviously carry a much deeper cultural, historical weight.
Precisely.
One thing that I thought interesting about these stories, and this is in relation to Siausi Ilayu's perspective, that this conflict was religious based, right? That there was a conflict of who should be held as the highest regard as God. Should it be Tangaloa or should it be Hikuleo? And it almost sounds like kind of similar to Tupo the First and some of the challenges that he put out to the Christian God. Well, if your God is the true God, that, they would, the taupatahi, the shark wouldn't eat you, or that your God would stop the tide from coming forth and, sticking a stick into the ground, into the sand on the beach. And this is kind of interesting. Just listening to the stories here of Tuna Fata and their nephew Ulumasui, I think is his name. These seems to be challenges by Talakai Faiki of, well, if your God is the real God, then move this rock, or, they kill each other and they get resurrected. I don't know if it has a lot of grounds to it, but it seems interesting.
These extraordinary feats tied to figures like Ulumasui, they elevate the Samoan struggle within the whole narrative. They really underscore that deep connection between the spiritual and the political in Polynesian cosmology.
Yeah,
Right.
100%.
Attributing
That's
mana
true.
like that suggests divine blessing for the Samoan cause. It implies the very forces of nature, the land, the sea, were on their
There we
side
go.
against foreign oppression.
Yeah.
It gives their victory this sense of sacred legitimacy and reinforces the heroic status of the leaders.
So, okay, the Tongans are routed. They're fleeing to their ships at Molefanua. And this sets up that iconic moment, the encounter that leads to the Malietoa title. What happened right there?
So as Talakai Faiki and what's left of his forces reach their canoes near Molefanua, they're confronted by the pursuing Samoans, Tuna, and Fata. He realizes he's about to escape, but he's facing these really determined warriors. So Talakai Faiki, standing on this prominent rock, which later became known as Tulutule,
Tulutule.
he addresses his pursuers. And it's at this critical moment that he utters that now famous speech.
The speech that birthed one of Samoa's highest titles. Can you share that key phrase again?
Absolutely. In Samoan, he declared, Malietoa, Malietoa, uteleto sao ile oli di tau, ai ole usao ile ili li follow.
And the English translation.
Brave warriors bravely fought. I shall return no more in the black clouds of war, but I shall return in the black clouds of sail.
Malietoa, brave warriors. And from those words,
I think this is an important thing to have a conversation on real quick, right? Number one, like I said, I have a lot of doubts as to whether this was an actual war and just a singular battle. But let's walk through what was said here, right? They just mentioned it in the podcast, but it says, according to Samoan oral history and historical accounts, Tu'i Tonga Talakai Faiki, as he was fleeing Samoa after being defeated by the brothers Tuna and Fata, it is said to have delivered a famous speech from a rock later called Taula. The words attributed to him are Malietoa, Malietau, Afai o Mai Tonga, e sau ile auliuli folau, ai le sau ole auliuli tau. All right, that's my Samoan interpretation there. And it says, brave warriors, bravely have you fought. If the Tongans ever come back, it will be for a friendly visit, not to wage war. Okay. Number one, there's not a lot of, even the oral history of multiple battles, right? But the question is, does this sound like someone who was defeated in a war where they're saying, hey, if the Tongans ever come back, it will be for a friendly visit, not for war. It doesn't sound like he's being threatened, like he can't come back. It's not like, hey, guys, do I need to get your permission to come back to Ha'amoa? It sounds like he's just saying, guys, when I come back, we're not going to be for war. I saw a video, and I think King Afa makes a reasonable position on this, a concept that it was intended not to kill Talakai Faiki. Because I think, I agree with King Afa's analysis on here, is that would have been a fatal flaw by Tuna and Fata, right? If Talakai Faiki gets killed, we're not just talking about the Tongans. We're talking about the Polynesian Empire is going to come and wipe them out. And I will even say this. They probably don't even need everyone from outside of Ha'amoa. I would say even the loyalists within Ha'amoa themselves probably would have crushed Tuna and Fata. And I'll explain to you why I say that. Because Malietoa didn't even unite all of Samoa. Right? So that tells me it wasn't like they united the all of Samoa and they had this, established leadership. It sounds like they had a significant enough rallying of people to oppose Talakai Faiki. Talakai Faiki wasn't there for war. It sounds like some kind of celebratory thing. Some say it's his birthday, whatever. I don't know. But they weren't there intended for war. Right? And he doesn't get killed. And then he says, when I come back, it's going to be for a good time. I'm not going to come back and fight you guys. And actually, you know what? Good job. Maybe he felt impressed that they stood up for themselves. I don't know. But I find that very interesting. And, even after that, multiple generations later, Kaulfo Nuafekai, he comes to Ha'amoa after he creates the Tu'i Hatakalaua in Tonga to run the administrative portion of the Polynesian Empire. He goes to Ha'amoa, and oral history says that the Tu'i Tonga resides in Ha'amoa for 4 or 5 generations, whatever it is, before Tapu Osi returns back to Tonga Tapu. But I think that's kind of interesting. Number one, it doesn't sound like it was an actual war, more like a battle. And it doesn't seem to me that Talakai Faiki is saying, yeah, you've kicked me out. No, he's just saying, hey, I'll be back. But when I come back, it won't be the war. Don't worry. I won't come back and wipe you out. I respect you for what you did, in essence. let's see here. Let's see. Interesting. Let's see. Comment here from Easy. Why are we watching a video created by a Palangi? We can tell our own stories. Well, it's called Enati Creative. I'm assuming this is probably produced by some Polynesians. They're just using AI to talk it out. So it's probably run by some Polynesians, to be honest, Easy. But definitely AI and Palangi voices they chose to tell the story. Let's see here. Let's come back.
The esteemed Samoan chiefly title Malietoa originated, which, as you said, is now one of the 4 Tamaiga, the highest titles in Samoa.
That's right.
But our sources mentioned there are some variations in the traditions about who actually got the title first.
Yeah, that's pretty common with oral histories, right? Different perspectives, interpretations develop over time.
100%.
One prominent version says Tuna and Fata immediately started arguing over who deserved it.
Oh, dear. After all that.
Yeah, even getting violent, striking each other down.
Why are you not investing in tax rates?
Snap.
No, seriously. Why are you not investing?
Pause the noise here. Then that's, this is the important thing about oral history is, it has different perspectives. Some of it is accurate. Some of it is not. Not all oral history is designed to be 100% accurate. It's more of maybe to be more memorable and maintain some of the core concepts, but not necessarily to be an exhaustive effort of recording every minute detail.
It was then that Ulumasui supposedly stepped in, revived the brothers.
Using his mana again.
Presumably. And suggested they give the title to their elder brother, Savea, to basically stop the conflict and keep unity.
A diplomatic solution.
Exactly. So consequently, Malietoa Savea is generally recognized as the first holder of this really significant title. But yeah, other accounts offer variations. Some say Savea just naturally took leadership and was recognized. Others say Tuna and Fata were meant to get it but deferred. Or maybe they gave it to Ulumasui out of gratitude.
It's fascinating how all these different threads exist.
Another interesting thread of the oral history is that Tuna and Fata were not even born and raised in Samoa, that they could have been from like Tokelau or maybe Tokelau or another island. There's some of the oral history there that I've heard. I don't know if that's from outside of Samoa, but there has been some oral history that Tuna and Fata were from other islands and happened to relocate to Samoa and led that that whole rebellion. So that's another interesting aspect of the oral history as well.
But they all point back to this pivotal moment in the origin of the Malietoa title. It really underscores just how profoundly significant this event was in shaping Samoan history, their collective identity.
Totally.
And these titles are still incredibly influential today, which just shows the lasting impact of that historical turning point.
Precisely. The Malietoa title itself, it works like a powerful mnemonic device, a living embodiment of this historical moment. It's a constant reminder of the liberation, the ancestors' bravery, the conflict itself, and also that promise of future peaceful interaction in Talakefaiki's words. By embedding this whole foundational story within such a high, respected title, the memory is actively kept alive, passed down through generations. It deeply shapes Samoan identity and historical consciousness.
Okay, so the rebellion works, direct Tongan rule ends, the Malietoa title is
Once
born.
again, I'm definitely not a believer of the direct Tongan rule or independence. It's more like the Tu'i Tonga recognized Malietoa, gives him, hey, maintain influence or authority over that portion of Samoa, but not really like an independent nation. And really, if the Tu'i Tonga really wanted to, solidify his rule and wanted, this is one of the reasons why I don't think it was an oppressive matter, because if Talakefaiki was an oppressive kind of iron fist kind of leader, he would not tolerate this type of rebellion and then say, oh yeah, we'll let you live. If he was really iron fisted and cruel, trust me, he would have been back with an army to wipe people out, in my perspective.
What were the consequences then, immediate and longer term?
Well, the most immediate, biggest consequence around 1250 AD was just that.
Yeah.
The end of direct Tongan political control over Upolu and Savaii.
Right.
This starts a new era of Samoan autonomy, and it marks the rise of the Malietoa lineage as this dominant political force within Samoa. But, and this is crucial, the relationship didn't just like stop. Interactions continued in different ways. For instance, some later Tui Tonga are actually recorded as having lived in Samoa for long periods. And that practice of elite intermarriage.
The Togatufa.
Well, maybe not exactly that, but intermarriage between Tongan and Samoan chiefly families persisted. In some ways, it even intensified in the centuries after. We even have Malietoa Savea himself marrying a daughter of a Tui Tonga. So those connections endured.
Interesting. So even after this major conflict asserting Samoan independence, the ties weren't completely cut. And the sources also hint this Samoan victory might have even caused ripples back in Tonga politically.
That's a really insightful point. Yeah, in the centuries after the Samoan rebellion, Tonga went through some significant internal political changes. Around 1470 CE, Tui Tonga Kalawhanua established the Tuna Fata Dynasty.
Okay.
Strategically delegating secular power, administrative duties to this new line, while the Tui Tonga themselves took on a more sacred spiritual role.
Dividing the...
Kind of. And then later around...
I wanna pause that real quick and pull something up, see if I can pull it out here. And I just want to show, like, that idea that somehow that drove change and significant issues back in Tonga. I want to see if I can find Devita Fale's Tui Tonga line here. Let's pull it up. And we'll take a look here and see if we can find this. Let's stop the screen share here. We'll just look at this Tui Tonga line here from Devita Fale. Share screen, window, and there we go. Let's pull this up real quick. All right, so right there. Let's see, which Talakai Faiki was it? And that's the other thing too. Multiple Tui Tongas have the same name, and we'll just revisit this. Some of our usuals already understand this, but here's the Catholic list, Shirley Baker list, and Devita Fale's list of the Tui Tongas. Catholic list has 39 Tui Tongas. Shirley Baker's list has 48 Tui Tonga, and Devita Fale's list has 54. Now, a big challenge that was done here by Devita Fale is he actually ties a lot of these names to the 6 or 7 settlements of the Tui Tonga throughout Tonga Tapu. And so these names are tied to ruins throughout Tonga Tapu, and also a lot of the oral history where a lot of these names are repeated, right? Like you see here, Lomi Aitupua the first, you had Pui Pui Kifatu, and some of these guys, as typical, a lot of these Tui Tongas were named after ancestors. So I'm trying to see on which, so there's Kaulfo Nua Fekai. There's, okay, so sorry. So this Talakai Faiki, it's Talakai Faiki the third, who also has the Lomi Artupua name. And the reason why I know that this is the right Talakai Faiki, and this is where kind of the dates kind of go weird, right? Because there's other Talakai Faikis and they could say it's much later or much earlier. But the reason why I know this is the right Talakai Faiki is because this Tui Tongas called Ma'akatoa, this name was in remembrance of when Talakai Faiki switches a lot of the processes of presenting tribute to the Tui Tonga, right? Where they're lifting the pigs, they're counting it, they're inspecting it. That's where Ma'akatoa, that name comes from, because they actually solidified everything is done correctly to limit future surprise attacks on the Tu'i Tonga because the whole structure and the process had been created. So here we have Talakai Faiki here, the 33rd Tu'i Tonga, who establishes the name and the title of Malietoa. Then we come down to Ka'ulufonua Fekai, who is actually the third Ka'ulufonua. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 6 Tu'i Tongas later. Right? Now, granted, there was a lot of, I think, before Ka'ulufonua Fekai, his father Takalawa, 2 or 3 Tu'i Tongas before that were assassinated. So there was some chaos that was going on, and a lot of it was driven. Like, here's an interesting story that Siausi Ilayu shared, is this Tu'i Tonga right here, this Tapuosi or Havea II, was actually, the mother was from Uvea, and when they got crowned, or he, Tapuosi III, got crowned as the Tu'i Tonga, he was assassinated, and a lot of the people from Uvea and Futuna blamed Takalaua and said that he was behind the assassination, and because of that, it was people from Uvea who actually assassinated Takalaua, and that's who Ka'ulufonua Fekai chases throughout the empire and chases them down to Uvea. And that's where they capture the assassins, and then Ka'ulufonua Fekai brings them back to Tonga, in many ways brutally and slowly kills them. And then he establishes the Tu'iha Takalaua, and then Ka'ulufonua Fekai moves the residents of the Tu'i Tonga to Ha'amoa. So just kind of some of the backstory of when that's all happening. So from Talakai Faiki to Ka'ulufonua Fekai, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Tu'i Tongas between that time. All right. Looks like there may be a question that popped up here. Oh, a couple comments here. Rebellion, or more like, did a great act of full of mana. I'll let you slide, because that's kind of one way to kind of explain it from my perspective, T-Style, because if it was really viewed as this threat to the power of the Tu'i Tonga, and it was, a threat to his life, that would have been squashed, in my opinion. But it's more like he was impressed, and it may be tied to some of that oral history that was shared earlier. Not only an act of God and bravery in that battle, but it sounds like, if some of the other Samoan oral history is true, that there were other feats before then that Talakai Faiki kind of put out there to say, hey, if you really are who you think you are, move this big boulder, or, stop the seas from doing things. So it sounds to be a broader recognition of things there. Question, would you say, Tua, that how the video is presenting, that it made great changes to Tongan culture? Was that in rituals or just some of the customs as security measurements? Well, that's where it kind of gets interesting. It seems to be recorded in the rituals of the security measures. Obviously, that has a huge impact, because that's now every time the Tu'i Tonga has tribute and everything presented to him, that there is a direct impact on that. Now, where it gets interesting is if it was a religious question involved, like Siausi Ilayu brings up, that this was a big part of this whole situation was because of religion. Depending on how that whole religious question was impacted or impacted head on Talakai Faiki, maybe that's what led to other changes outside of that, which is interesting. That's just kind of some ideas and drawing conclusions from some of the oral history and the information that Siausi Ilayu made. And maybe, and this is an interesting thing to consider, maybe this switch in the religious perspective led to the assassination of the Tu'i Tonga, because it's like 3 Tu'i Tonga shortly after Talakai Faiki get assassinated. like back to back to back. So something had changed significantly that led to that instability, which kind of gives more credence to Siausi Ilayu's perspective that this was not really a rebellion for freedom by the Malietoa clan, but it was more of resistance to religious change that Talakai Faiki was looking to impose. I don't know if that answers your question, T-Style, but that's some of the ideas or thoughts that come to mind associated with that concept. Let's share the screen, come back here. Let's come back here real quick.
On 1600 CE, the Tui Kanokupolu dynasty emerged. They eventually became the dominant political power in Tonga, and they're the direct ancestors of the modern Tongan monarchy.
And both of these later Tongan dynasties, they kept strong family links back to Samoa, didn't they?
Absolutely. The name itself, Tui Kanokupolu, it literally translates to something like king of the flesh or heart or body of Upolu, directly referencing the Samoan island.
Wow, that's explicit.
It is. The founder of this really influential line, Gata, was the son of a Tui Hatakalawa ruler and a high-ranking Samoan woman.
Right.
So this strongly suggests that maybe losing direct political control over Samoa prompted this kind of strategic rethink within Tonga.
Thinking about going solar.
See, and this is where some of these ideas kind of grow out. That is accurate oral history, right? That the Tui Kanokupolu rises out of a marriage of the Tui Hatakalaua to a Samoan woman that leads to ngata and that whole situation there. But I know that it's kind of funny. A lot of our Samoan brothers and sisters, they take that as, well, see, just kind of like the language analysis, right? See, like you guys had to intermarry into the Samoan side because they believe that Tangaloa was from Ha'amoa, and that's had to marry into the bloodlines in Ha'amoa to elevate us. And they make comments like, "Oh, Tongans are a bunch of commoners," and that's why they had to intermarry into the Ha'amoa because the Tangaloa. And I'm just like, guys, if you understood that the Tui Kanokupolu was the lowest of the kingly lines, that you wouldn't say those things because it undercuts and really it diminishes the influence of the Ha'amoa people, because like we mentioned earlier, there was the Tui Tonga who had religious, political, and administrative power over the government. The lowest of those two responsibilities is the government and the administrative tasks of that government. The higher is the religious component. So the Tui Tonga creates the Tui Hatakalaua to do the lower tasks of the management of the government, right? Then the Tui Hatakalaua then creates the Tui Kanokupolu to do that task. That's even lower, right? And further away from the Tui Tonga. So really, it's this is why when they say, "Oh, commoners, brothers and sisters," if we use that logic, then the marrying into the Tui Kanokupolu and making them basically the arms and legs to do that work, that doesn't work well for the Ha'amoa position of that. So I think that's something that's kind of forgotten in the mix there. Another interesting thing that I had learned here from Maui Tegelangi was the Tui Kanokupolu. By the time Tui Tonga, by the time Tupou the First gets there, it's an elections kind of system. And I had always assumed that was always the case for the Tui Kanokupolu, and that it was, because of the Ha'amoa influence and the Matai prospect. That's one idea. Maui Tegelangi shares that the Tui Kanokupolu was actually father to son. However, it was a very unstable line. And a lot of reasons behind that is there were about 2 or 3 Kanokupolu lines that only had one child. And therefore, when it was only one child to inherit, and that happens 2 times, there's not a wider pool of the family when there's no heir to fill into the gaps. And that led to instability, and therefore a voting system kind of materialized to try and provide more stability, because there was not a lot of confidence in the ability of the Tu'i Kanokupolu line to maintain stability in managing the administration of the government of the Tu'i Tonga Empire. There are examples where the heir apparent of the Tu'i Tangaloa would be installed as the Tu'i Kanokupolu to try and provide leadership and stability to the Tu'i Kanokupolu line, and then later inheriting the Tu'i Tangaloa line after their service in the Tu'i Kanokupolu line. And once again, a lot of that was trying to provide stability in the administration and the management of the government. Here's an interesting question from Legrand. Why didn't the British back the Tu'i Tonga over the Tu'i Kanokupolu line if it were the weakest of the kingly lines? When Cook was in Tonga, who was at the height of the Tongan society, Tu'i Tonga or Tu'i Kanokupolu? Also, where was Tangaloa during those times? Okay. Interesting comments there. Appreciate it, Legrand. So, why didn't the British back the Tu'i Tonga over the Tu'i Kanokupolu line if it were the weakest of the kingly lines? Because from the perspective of the British, political and administrative power was what the British understood, right? If you don't have control over the political and the military, then you don't have quote unquote power. That's the way I would answer that first comment there, Legrand. They looked at the Tu'i Kanokupolu as the administrative and the political power. They recognized that as more of the power and the influence. The Tu'i Tonga was elevated above the Tu'i Kanokupolu. However, that was in a religious and in a cultural aspect. And I'll give you this example, Legrand. Even after Tupou I organized the government of Tonga and was the head of the Tongan government, in the political and in the military sense, yes, King George Tupou I was in charge. But in any traditional cultural event, George Tupou I was below the Tu'i Tonga, Laufiri Tonga. This is why Mr. Aotearoa and us, one of the things that we discuss very heavily is Laufiri Tonga's choice to give Tupou I a taumafakava, because the Tu'i Kanokupolu does not have a taumafakava. A taumafakava is a singular cultural tradition that was only for the Tu'i Tonga, even though the Tu'i Tongas was called Furitaunga, but it was a taumafakava in a sense. That's not something you win by war. You inherit that by appointment. And so what's miraculous that happens, and a lot of people make this mistake, they say, oh no, King George Tupou I defeated Laufiri Tonga in the Battle of Velata. Laufiri Tonga was not the Tu'i Tonga then. He was just a young chief vying for political and military power. Once Laufiri Tonga becomes the Tu'i Tonga, you do not engage in administrative, political, and military entanglements, because that is beneath the Tu'i Tonga title, right? This is why when Tupou I was uniting all of Tonga You know one village and one area that Tupou the First never entered? Mu'a, La Paja. And Mu'a didn't even have defensive fortifications. A lot of the other villages and towns, they had kolotaus, right? Defensive structures. And Tupou the First would just go in and just one by one beat them. He never went into Mu'a. And Mu'a didn't even have a defensive structure. Why? Because that is not the role of the Tu'i Tonga, and the Tu'i Tonga is above that. Okay? So what is miraculous, Legrand, is Laufiri Tonga, for whatever reason, has a different vision for the future of Tonga. He sees Tupou the First, obviously a talented politician, a talented warrior in military, obviously talented in bringing people together to put together coalitions, and understands how to navigate this new threat to Tongan independence, the Western concept of government. Laufiri Tonga then says, I am not going to challenge Tupou the First, and actually, I'm going to empower him. I'm going to give him a kava ceremony, which is the traditional way of receiving power and authority. That's what happened with the first Tu'i Tonga from Tangaloa. That's why there's a kava bowl and the whole discussion of how the kava would be structured, because Tangaloa is signifying to everyone Ahoeitu is now who's going to be embodied with power and authority to lead as the leader. Laufiri Tonga does the exact same thing for Tupou the First. He gives Tupou the First a taumafakawa and then tells Tupou the First, the Tu'i Tonga line will end with me, right? Because he will have heirs, and he understands that if he doesn't give Tupou the First a kava ceremony, he is handicapped. There's not enough stability. There's always someone vying for power. And the biggest weakness that Tupou the First has is he's from the lowest kingly line and does not have that appointment of the culture and the history behind him. Hopefully that answers that question there. And then the next part is, when Cook was in Tonga, who was at the height of the Tongan society, Tu'i Tonga or Tu'i Kanokupolu? Tu'i Tonga was the height, but the Tu'i Kanokupolu, once again, is the administrative and the political power in charge. Also, where was the Hatakalaua during those times? The Tu'i Hatakalaua, if you go and read a book by George Vason, there is a discussion of the last Tu'i Hatakalaua there, Muriki Ha'amea. He gets killed in a battle, and then out of that instability, the Tu'i Kanokupolu enforces military influence and administrative influence to not have the Tu'i Hatakalaua reinstated. And obviously the Tu'i Tonga doesn't get involved in that, but that's what happens, and the Tu'i Hatakalaua line doesn't have that influence anymore. However, this is another interesting thing, Legrand. What's the name of the book? It is, just search George Vason, and I think, Life Amongst the Tongans in Polynesia, but George Vason. So just the name George, and then the last name is V as in Victor, A-S-O-N. I want to type it in here into the chat so you can see the name. If you search it up, you'll find it. George Vason. There you go. I just put that in the chat so people have that. Here's there was a thought that I was going to share. Oh, here's an interesting comment to go along with that, Legrand. Is you could make the argument today that it's actually the Tu'i Hatakalaua line that is in power. So when Queen Salote becomes the queen or the monarch of Tonga, there is a huge challenge that she has. tradition in Tonga is it is the male line that carries the authority, right? And with Tupo II not having a son and his daughter being crowned as queen, there is a real threat to the stability and the capacity of the quote unquote Tupo family to maintain power. It is by design and not by chance that she was arranged to be married with Tungi Mairefihi, because he is the heir. If the Tu'iha Takalaua was installed from father to son, and was not impeded by the Kanokupolu and the political and military unrest during that time, Tungi is the rightful heir of the Tu'iha Takalaua line. So when Queen Salote marries into Tungi, because the traditional way is father to son, one could make the argument that it is the Tu'iha Takalaua line that is leading in the Tupo family today, because inheritance is through the male line, and since Tungi Mairefihi is the Tu'iha Takalaua heir and also a very close relative of the Tu'itonga, that's why he married to Queen Salote, and that's why that marriage was critical. It solidified or reinstated stability and cultural and historical justification for the current ruling family to maintain its rule. So that would be something that I would kind of give on that. So looks like a follow-up comment. So basically, like today in Tonga, pretty much the king still rules Tonga, but there's a government set in place, 2 different lanes. Does that explain how it was with the 2 back in the days of Tonga? I think I understand your question. That's how it was back in the day, Legrand, but because the last Tu'itonga gave Tupo the First a kava ceremony, and in a sense handed the torch off to him, and also because Queen Salote married back into the Tu'iha Takalaua line, you could say that this is a very stable, and it's still the same family from the Tu'itonga ruling to this day. Quick comment here from Josh. Can you one day do a podcast of East Polynesian, have her closer DNA and language matches to people in central northern outliers in Solomon Islands than to Samoa? Let me see if I can copy and paste this comment. How can I do this? Let me try and do something with that, Josh. Let me put this in Polynesian Eyes Podcast at Gmail. If you could send, I can't copy it right now off of the platform we're using, Josh. If you could just copy and paste your comment in an email, I can follow up with it. If you also have any guests that you think would be very beneficial for us to invite to talk through this, Josh, send us that recommendation. And if you know their contact, send it over, and we can just kind of have that discussion on that as a potential topic. So I appreciate that, Josh. Let's see. All right, perfect. Let's try and close out our AI podcast here and close out the show for today.
It involves weaving influential Samoan lineage into the very fabric of the Tongan power structure. Some historians even suggest this led to a sort of Samoanized governance and culture in Tonga over time.
So the whole relationship between Tonga and Samoa, it shifts from direct imperial rule to something much more complex. Political independence for Samoa, but alongside these enduring kinship ties and significant mutual influence.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how history reshapes power dynamics, transforms relationships long term.
It really is. The whole story of the Tu'i Empire's influence in Samoa and that rebellion, it just gives such a compelling picture of the complex interplay of power, culture, identity in pre-colonial Polynesia.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, and even conflict can lead to new kinds of connection and mutual shaping.
Well said.
So, just to quickly wrap up our deep dive today, we've journeyed through the rise and pretty extensive reach of the Tui Tonga Empire, its centuries-long influence in Samoa, the pivotal Samoan rebellion led by legends like Tuna Fata and the amazing Ulumasui,
Tuna and Fata.
and the enduring significance of Tui Tonga Talakaifeki's fateful words, birthing the Malietoa title. It's such a powerful story, really highlighting that deeply interwoven history of Tonga and Samoa.
And it powerfully underscores that their relationship, yeah, it had conflict, it had dominance, but it's also fundamentally rooted in these deep kinship ties.
Yeah.
That connection, often beautifully expressed with the term takusa.
Takuto, right.
This shared history has just profoundly shaped the cultural, the political identities of both nations. It leaves this lasting legacy of connection, mutual influence that still resonates today.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the enduring power of oral traditions, historical events, and shaping a nation's identity, its collective memory, not just in Samoa and Tonga, but across all cultures. Think about that vital role language and titles play, preserving and transmitting history from one generation to the next. That's definitely your food for thought this time. Malo, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Played next to Dwayne Johnson.
No, he played behind me.
So
Hey, how would you like to-
let me this is pretty cool. I appreciate so everybody can maybe check them out, subscribe to them. It's always cool to support other content creators here, but it's Enati Creative. It looks like they do, they're looks like they're from Ha'amoa. They do a lot of Ha'amoa news, legends, and so forth, politics in Ha'amoa. So kind of interesting. I enjoyed that. So I subscribed to them just to see what other kind of stories that they bring up. So appreciate that. With that being said, we are bringing to a close another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. Appreciate everyone's comments, the interactions online. Apologize, we weren't able to get to every question and every comment just because of the volume of the comments, but we tried to get as much engagement and involvement from people online. You know what, guys? Here's one thing. We're going to close with this. April was our most interactive month of all time for the podcast, and especially on YouTube. Typically we get a lot of our engagement on TikTok, and that's usually been our kind of most interactive comments, shares, and so forth, and views. April, for whatever reason, was just off the charts. I mean, I'm talking about triple to quadruple of our views, comments, and so forth. So really appreciate everyone's willingness to comment, share, subscribe. It goes a long way. We're steadily reaching towards hopefully one day we'll get a better mic. It's either that or I need to tone down my voice. I get it. Seems like it's kind of getting out of control here, but great month. We're marching towards 1,000 subscribers, marching on YouTube. We're getting close to, I think we're marching towards 2,000, maybe 3,000, 2,000 or 3,000 on TikTok. But really appreciate everyone's feedback and in the comments. Once again, as always, our position is we are one people. We have always been one people. We are, in many ways, still one nation, though we've been kind of sliced and diced, and we have different flags and we have different governments. But that doesn't change the fact that we are all related, literally, physically related, and then also we share the same cultural, religious, and kind of traditional belief systems. And it's really important that more of our people have these conversations, to really just deep dive, have conversations, and really explore what our ancestors did. I really do believe, our Polynesian people are going to turn the corner. I feel like we're going to have we already have a huge impact on the world. Overall, I know the most obvious one is in sports, but we're spreading into entertainment, we're spreading into politics, we're spreading into content creation, and for a small group of people who lived on small specks of land on the largest ocean, it's miraculous. We definitely have a lot to contribute to this world, and a big place to start to do that is to have more conversations. Help us understand the great history that we share, that will hopefully drive us together to be more unified, because the more unified we are, the greater the impact we'll have in the culture of the world overall. I think we will bring a lot of stability and bring back a lot of the craziness that we see out there. With that being said, as always, be bold. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. And until next time, peace.